morning, everyone. Today I am with Professor Graham Dutfield, and whose profile is so enriched that I cannot, explain in very little time. But one thing I find very, very distinct about him is that he is well versed in other disciplines which mean a lot for law, like history, like anthropology, like political science. And I must confess that I started my own book by reading his first book, that is that very field, that is intellectual property rights and life science industry, past, present, and future. And that has become a kind of backbone for my, research and thesis and all that. And I was, when I was going through it, it was so fascinating. And you can easily grasp that very thing because various conversations which Professor Dutfield has highlighted, they are still in my mind. It was beautifully represented. So let us get into his profile. He is now, as of now, he is a professor of international governance in University of Leeds School of Law. And before that, he was the Herschel Smith Senior Research Fellow at CCLS Queen Mary. He has been teaching intellectual property law since 2003. And he has worked with the late Dr. Darrell Posey. And few things I must highlight because the profile is so large. So I will be just picking up what is of my interest. So I must mention that he, from 2001, he served as an academic director of the ICTST UNCTAD capacity building project on intellectual property rights and development. And he has been advisor to various governments that I was knowing personally, including those of Brazil, Ghana, Namibia, St. Lucia, and Zambia. And as well as the Portfolio Committee on the Trade and Industry of the South African Parliament and the former United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food. Apart from that, I must tell the audience that he has a great research interest, and that research interest I must reflect. That was, he is greatly, interested, or largely interested in research on intellectual property, crosses several disciplines, including law, history, politics, economics, and anthropology. And it is a famous saying that, there was a small incident where son asked his father, who was a judge, that what should I read for becoming a lawyer? And he said that you study history, you study philosophy, you study psychology, you study political science, and little bit of law. So you can understand that how all these disciplines build the base for law. And if you're not knowing these things or understanding these things, you never grasp the legal issues. So in that way, I must appreciate that he has been covering all the important areas which come or which interact with law. So that is very fascinating. So because I don't want to, prolong it. So this is it about him. And as of now, as I have mentioned about this very book, his next book is coming, which is titled as, and I hope that it is a sequel of that previous book, which I have just mentioned. But it is altogether different because you covered the pharmaceutical industry this time more exclusively. So it is titled, it is titled as that High Design of Purest Gold, a critical history of the pharmaceutical industry from 1880 to 2020. So this is a very long span of time which you have covered, and because you have already been involved in various kind of happenings which are there in this very realm, so you'll be very closely watching what is going on. So from your book only, I got few things which are very, very, critical to tell the audience so that they must understand what we are going to discuss. So here, first thing which has catched my attention was you have used the term a critical history rather than a history, which you have explained also in your book. So this is one of the reason, I mean, I was a little fascinated by this, that how people approach the historical inquiries. So here, why you have used this very term critical before history, that is one thing. The other thing, I'm just reading from your chapter, you have quoted the philosopher Gerald Siegel, who rightly says that drawing for his ideas as well, all must do on the work of others. What authors produce are not texts. This is very fascinating. What authors produce are not texts, but works which differ from texts precisely in being animated by some person's activation of language to express thoughts or beliefs. And here you have talked about yourself also. This book embodies wholly or in part the imprint of my personality, for better or for worse. And there is nobody living in the world who would ever write the same book. That is very, very peculiar and very particular. And they might be able to write a better book, but it would not be this one. So this was very important to highlight. That is why I highlighted
Yes.
that. And as I told you that the structure of our discussion would be like this, that first we will catch up not about the book, but about the historical inquiry. And then we will getting involved in the book. And lastly, we will be a little bit discussing about the current scenario, this COVID,
Okay. Yeah, good. Okay.
Start with by asking you that why historical inquiries have fascinated you, first of all, and why you are, aligned to that. So over to you.
Okay, well, let me just say briefly, my unusual background is that my background is actually geography. I have no law degrees at all. So I followed a strange kind of journey. But one thing that that has taught me, because of course I teach almost exclusively law students, I say, similar to the judge you mentioned to me before, is that if you want to really understand law, you must not confine your search to the law literature.
Yeah.
That's never going to tell you everything that you need to know. So why history? Well, years ago, apart from the fact I love history anyway.
Yeah.
I'm you can say I'm a failed historian. I'm a failed scientist. I'm a failed musician. There are lots of things that I can't do, which I wish I could do. But at least being an academic allows me to be a historian as well as a legal scholar, for which I'm grateful. So, but my interest in history, as in terms of actually studying history, goes back to the early 2000s when I worked in Geneva for an organization called International Center for Trade and Sustainable Development. And that was a time, of course, just post WTO, the TRIPS agreement, when developing countries were placed under immense pressure to basically align their IP laws to those of the United States and Europe, which in a sense was, you could say, compressing what took over 100 years of legal evolution in Europe and North America to a 10-year transition period, more or less, right? Which seemed to me somehow, well, a lot to ask for, a lot to demand. And so I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to see, well, what did the rich countries do when they were poor countries? And well, history shows that generally, the British copied from other parts of the world when we were a growing nation. Americans copied from us, and so so what goes around comes around, you might say. So if you're, how do you learn? You learn by imitation. You learn by copying, and then you learn to innovate independently, right? It just seems to me plainly obvious, but history backs it out. Now, so you can say those countries had very, let's say, weak IP systems when they were catching up, or when they were going through that growth. But doesn't mean it worked. because it's not automatically to be assumed that it would work, right? But there is enough evidence to show that it can work. It often did in the past. If it did in the past, why wouldn't it work now, right? And historians often debate about revolution and continuity. In other words, I mean, are we talking about, is it a different world now from what it was before, or is it the same? Was there an industrial revolution? Was there an age of enlightenment? Did the revolution really happen, or is it that we look back 200 years later and think everything changed? Suddenly, maybe it didn't quite so much the way we think it did. So the relevance of history is an ongoing debate, but I actually found it quite politically useful, right? So in I think 2005 there was a big conference in Geneva at WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization. They had a conference prior to a meeting to discuss a substantive patent law treaty, a strong harmonization treaty. And I was invited to speak. And my argument was harmonization would be a terrible thing for developing countries. It would be very, very bad for their interests. But rather than me bang on the table and get angry and passionate, I thought, I'm from the UK, and I'm an academic, right? I'm not a political activist. So what I would do is I would just calmly go through the history and make that point using the historical evidence, right? And I'm sure it wasn't because of me, but those negotiations the following week stopped. And of course, there is no substantive patent law treaty. So, a number of people like-minded with me managed to have enough power in their argument to convince countries that let's not go any further with these negotiations. All right, so let me move on to the book, Why Does History Matter? And also why the title.
Yeah.
Well, I saw that phrase, that high design of purest gold, I saw it in a church in London, actually one of the only medieval churches in the city of London. It's perhaps not well known outside the UK, but in 1666, I think it was, there was a great fire of London, and all the churches were destroyed, but this one survived. So it's a very old church. And there was, on the wall of the church, a tribute to a man who had died. A man had died in the early 17th century. I was very struck with that phrase. He was a doctor. Phrase, that high design of pure gold to make a medicine. So there's something that I think is to bring a medicine into the world that cures people is a wonderful, beautiful thing. Right? If scientists come up with amazing medicine, you think about things like insulin and penicillin. These are wonderful achievements that save the lives of many people. Yeah. Right? So I set that against a critical history.
Yeah.
Because there's the beauty and here's the reality.
Yeah.
And the two are not quite the same, unfortunately. Right? So if the industry was doing nothing more than making amazing medicines that save the lives of vast numbers of people, and of course it's industry, it should be allowed to make a profit. Of course it's business, right? And if they can put that money back into making new drugs, then that's good. But what about access and availability? Yeah. Do they make the right medicines? So all these questions arise. So I thought, well, if I'm going to critique the industry, and there are many critics of the industry, it's important to, and it sounds like why would you ask this question at all? But what is this industry?
Yeah.
Right. Does it have certain features that are so hardwired, right, that are so much embedded in the industry that it is such an inherent characteristic that you can't have the industry without it? So that's the sort of question that I wanted to know.
Yeah.
And defining what is the industry is, in a way, it is, to find out that question, I found it had to be, it required you to identify, when did this industry actually start, right? I mean, for thousands of years, of course, there have been healers. I mean, for a very, very long time, there have been people whose occupation was to make medicines and treat people, right? And that has been a commercial activity for hundreds of years, if not thousands, around the world. I mean, as there has been a money economy, people have made money out of health, out of selling treatments. All right. But when did the industry start? Right. And did the industry, was there a revolution? Was it like one day there was industry, the day before there wasn't? I mean, at what point do you say there is a pharmaceutical industry? Okay, so first the questions are, who are the actors and how do they behave? That makes them an industry, right? That is distinct. Well, there are a number of types of company that became what we now call pharmaceutical companies. And if you look at the histories of today's modern big corporations, you'll see that many of them do go back to those days, more or less, right? So you had the German chemical firms making dyes, right? So they're doing color chemistry, but they found that dyes that are used for coloring clothes can also be used for staining tissue in medical experiments. And that idea of selectivity of a dye, it acts selectively on particular cells, inspired this shift from dyes into drugs. So Bayer, the big German company, started off as a company that made dyes. One of the big chemical firms, it still exists, BASF, a German company. Now they don't do pharma at all, but that is Bayerische Aniline Fabriken in German. Aniline is a dye. They were making dyes. Of course, in those days, Germans were the world's best chemists. Right. They had very good universities. They were very advanced in chemistry. So there were those companies. And then you had companies that, small shops, pharmacy shops. And so what do they made medicines that were natural, basically natural products, plant-based, maybe plant, animal, also mineral, plant, animal, mineral-based medicines. So those shops grew and became corporations, right? And then you had, what's interesting, you had companies that sold branded products using basically trademarks, right? Branded products. So brand, right? And this is really quite important. So branded products. So these are companies that sometimes use patents, but they particularly use like trademarks. And often their products were secret recipes, and they often didn't work, or they were very questionable. I mean, they were advertised, they branded them, but often they were kind of fake things. They weren't very good products, usually, right? So as though some of those companies fell by the wayside, some became more honest. So in England, we had a company called Beecham's, right? Beecham became a big company. They started off selling very dodgy branded products, and then they became more honest, all right? And then you had companies like Glaxo selling, well, they sold milk products, milk powder. So you had also companies that did things like food type products, and they moved to medicines. So these sorts of companies were the original companies, and as those grew, they became the first pharmaceutical companies. And again, as I say, if you look back at some of the big American companies like Pfizer, right? They started off being like pharmacy shops, Eli Lilly and those. Okay, so so you have your actors, but then what makes them a pharmaceutical industry? Some of them already existed. So the German ones maybe go back to the 18th century, So how they become modern pharmaceutical companies? Now, you would probably suppose, well, it's science. That must be what it was. They became scientific, right? Now, that is only partly true. So talking about the pharmaceutical industry as inherently science-based, historically, is only partly true, right? Because really what we would call scientific products, they only really appear about 20 years later in the early 20th century, and still there weren't that many. You still had largely plant and mineral-based products were still the drugs that most doctors prescribed in Europe or in America, right? So they weren't initially science-based. So one of my hypotheses is that what makes the pharmaceutical industry an industry is not that it's science-based or not alone. It's not about regulation, but that is part of the answer. But it's also about a way of doing business. It's actually the business model, right? And when you look, well, Germany, actually, we often might think United States as being a pioneer. Of course, you think of Thomas Edison, right? He had a way of in-house research and development, finding lots of patents, etc. But that was a different sort of product. So medicines, it was the Germans. The Germans really pioneered IP strategy, which is still followed today. Now it's more advanced. And it's really important not to think it's just about patents. It's not just about patents. It's also about trademarks. Trademarks are incredibly important to this industry, right? And trademarks are important, as you probably know, in crowded markets where there are lots of substitutes. And trademarks are used to differentiate products that may, in fact, be the same in many aspects, right? So so history, the lesson of history tells me that actually the way of doing business is very much inherent. It's rooted in the industry right from the start, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
so I must, a little bit, I must intervene you. One, two things I must connect with the previous discussion also. Like if you are making historical inquiry, and as you have mentioned that it is my personality which is making that very inquiry. So in that sense, how you avoid the biases, how you could be more realistic. I mean, people may say that you belong to certain ideology, you may have been inquiring into the history in that way, and people may ask like may ask questions like you are not pro-industry people, that is why you are doing that very thing. So I'm just asking that how to maintain the objectivity while making that very inquiry. And I hope that you have also faced some problems or some say, obstacles while making that. So throw a little light upon that. And next thing is that when we say that pharmaceutical sector is based on industry, profit making, and many other things, so every industry has some sort of inclination towards that. But why they have the bad name? That is the question. I mean, other industries may not be bad criticized, but this industry, why it has been, condemned that much, or it has been was criticized. So just, if you share something regarding that.
Well, look, why do they get attacked? Well, first, I want to deal with the first part of what you asked me. One is that you can never please everybody. You can't please everybody. Well, I try to understand the industry and from their perspective, right? But I never will completely, because I'm not part of the industry. I've never worked. I have talked to people from the industry, and you talk to people who work in the industry, and there's no necessarily a sort of typical view, except because well, if you talk to scientists, a scientist just wants their medicine to go to the people, right? Because why do it otherwise, right? But the perspective of making money, well, let me just say that, you know, as a man of 60, right, years old, as I am this year, and one day I'm going to retire, I guess, and I'm looking forward to having a pension, right? Okay. Now, if I have a good pension, and I'm not quite sure if I will or not, but if I do, it will because a fund manager has invested my money, right? And I haven't really studied too carefully where where the university pension fund system, where they put their money, but it may well be that they put their money in the pharmaceutical industry, yeah. Right? Yeah. So in a way, if the industry is dysfunctional, in a sense, society as a whole has a sort of responsibility. We have a responsibility. In a way, we can't say it's all their fault, right?
Yeah.
If there is a misalignment, right, between what the industry does and what we think would be ideal for the public, you know, in a way, it's a question we have to ask ourselves, right? Is this something that we should accept? Who's to blame? Well, one thing I tried to show in this book, and I adopt this what I call sort of co-evolutionary approach, right? And where you have, you know, science, you have business, you have law and regulation, they interact with each other, right? So if this is if these different elements are misaligned, or you know, it's something that we can change, we can do something about this, right? If we are creating perverse incentives, then we can do something about it, right? And it's nothing new with industry. You know, we said to the tobacco industry, right? You know, you're not allowed to advertise. Actually, I don't think for prescription drugs, advertising should be allowed at all. I mean, it's done in the United States, and I think for me it's a big problem, right? Big problem. I don't think that should be allowed at all in the United States. There should be no advertising to the public, right? It's fair enough to inform health professionals of your products, but not the public. Right? So that's a regulatory issue, right? So regulation is what we need to look at. Now, intellectual property and regulation, they sort of, they're quite aligned. You think of data exclusivity. Is that regulation or IP? In a way, it's sort of, it's in between, right? So IP and regulation of products, et cetera, is something that you have to look at in a way altogether, right? But I mean, there are definitely things that are not right, okay? I mean, you look at some of the products. Are these products that the public really needs? You know, so I looked at the FDA's approvals for last year, and the first product approved was a rival treatment to Botox. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, is that going to save anybody's lives? No, not really. No. And of course, I would be unfair to industry if I said there weren't also some amazing products. There are good treatments for cancer, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I don't want to be too unfair, but there have over the years been issues about this. You know, they spend a lot of effort expanding the market for old drugs and extending the lives, the life cycles, the product life cycles of existing products. I mean, sometimes that can be good. You know, a new use for an old drug can be great, you know. There is a trend which the industry is not entirely, it's not their fault, but what you might call medicalization or sort of pharmaceuticalization, right? I often tell students, you know, If you are worrying about your health, but you feel perfectly well, I expect somebody is making money out of you.
Yeah.
Yeah, whether it's a gymnasium that you paid to use, or whether it's some food supplements that you don't really need, you know. So and then, but industry takes advantage of this, and in a way they do kind of push it to medicalization. So in other words, in a sense, you are inherently sick, even if you feel well, right? And it works in America. If you ever watch sort of TV shows in America, I'm very struck by how often people seem to know lots about medicines.
No.
Has personal experience, you know. Someone said in the book, you know, America is on drugs.
Yeah,
We're
yeah.
not talking about heroin or cocaine. We're talking about legal drugs, right? And sort of pharmaceuticalization. So Ritalin for kids that are hyperactive kids. Do they need to take a drug? Maybe they're bored, you know, maybe they need to be told, stop doing that, you know. Talk to your child, you know, maybe that's better rather than giving them a medicine that is related to amphetamine. Do you want kids to be taking medicines? I'm not really sure it's good. Sometimes yes, but often not. A tendency to focus on sort of chronic illnesses rather than cures. Of course, cures are a bit of a problem for industry.
Yeah.
A chronic illness, high blood pressure, or hypertension. Now, I have high blood pressure. Do I take medicines? No. I try and lead a reasonably relaxed life so I don't get too stressed because it's bad for you. Try and enjoy life, you know, have breaks, take walks, etc., etc. Walk in the garden, you know. Do I need to take, statins and ACE inhibitors? Not necessarily, no. But if I lived in America, probably I would be persuaded that I need to take your captopril or whatever, or statins, or whatever, you know. Also, of course, also the issue of neglected diseases as well, and diseases for the poor, lots of so-called Me Too drugs. And of course, you know, big pharma is obviously not the innovator, or not it's small companies doing the really clever stuff often, but they're better at funding the clinical trials and the marketing side of things. So, I mean, there's industry. I mean, industry, can it do better? Yes, a lot better. Is it entirely the industry's fault? No, because they are responding to signals from regulation, signals from the market. They're not getting pushback for charging high prices as much as they probably should be. So if we allow them to do things, they'll do these things. And they'll say, look, you know, we have to, this is a shareholder capitalism. We have to satisfy our shareholders, shareholder value, and, you know, the pension funds, et cetera, right? So is the industry performing as well as we'd like it to? No, of course, we can't expect an industry which is there to make money to do exactly what you want it to do, right? We can't expect that. And that is, of course, we recognize this because, of course, governments also fund a lot of biomedical research. They fund the research that industry does not have the incentive to do. And we accept this, right? We accept that, you know, taxpayers also have to pay for a certain amount of biomedical innovation, which is not going to be of interest to industry. So we recognize this. So we don't expect the industry is going to do all this stuff. You know, we don't. So we can't expect the industry to do everything we want to do, but that doesn't mean it can't do a lot better.
You mentioned your first-hand experience in your book, where your colleague, when you were in Africa, one of your has been treated by charcoal or something for hepatitis C.
Yeah, that's right. Yes,
it was a very touching.
I have no idea whether he had hepatitis or not. I don't know, but he put charcoal on his wrist and on his arm.
Yeah.
He was very he was feeling very sick, and then he sort of recovered. Yeah.
And you have also mentioned the kind of different accessibility problem of drugs there in Africa.
Yeah.
Like that model
Yes.
is not properly understood in other parts of the world. So can you explain
Yes.
that a little bit? Like what kind of accessibility problem is there? I mean, even
Well,
if
that's
yeah,
so
yeah,
yeah. So yeah. I mean, the accessibility problems are yeah. I mean, there are at least two kind of problems. One is that it is available but not accessible,
yeah,
or it's not available at all.
yeah, yeah,
Right? It might be available because because it's a small country, small market. The means of sort of distributing medicines may be very problematic, difficult. So infrastructural problems, but largely it's a market problem. It's a small market, right? You know, I mean, India obviously has a lot of people, right?
yeah,
Okay, quite a lot, right? I a couple of years ago, I was in the Caribbean, St. Lucia, population 150,000 people. Just one suburb of Delhi, right, is bigger than that.
yeah, yeah,
Well, okay, St. Lucia is not a very poor country, but you think of some countries, well, let's say Namibia, a large country, population about 2 million people, last I checked. You know, so who wants to supply this tiny market? It may be quite difficult, right? So there's market issues, but also access. Yeah, I mean, can people actually get the medicine, right? And it's well, look, it was in 1980s. I worked in I taught English in high school in Sudan, in Darfur, and so when somebody was sick, you know, with malaria, right, she sent a boy to the school where I worked to find me. She as the foreign guy, somehow I would have lots of medicines. Well, it's true. I had a year's supply of chloroquine tablets, and I was very happy to share them. Right, so what I did. But otherwise, you know, the infrastructure is very, very weak. Right, there's not many doctors, not many. And where do you go to get medicine? The hospital was unhygienic and in a very, very, very poor sort of condition. Equipment very poor. So yeah, of course, there's price as well.
yeah.
So yeah, I mean, well, patents are a problem, but patents are far from being the only problem, right? If there are no patents, there will still be problems, right?
Yes. So
I mean,
another thing which you have highlighted is about the current talk, which is sometimes very
yes.
conflicting. About on the one hand, we are talking about innovation, and we try to find innovation with the patents or any other IPR, whether it is triggering that or we are just talking that it is triggering. So
Yes.
innovation, you have also written that we demand progress through constant innovation. Only sometimes do we get innovation, at least of the kind that benefits the public more than the company. So there's a kind of a relative concept of that very innovation. Innovation is a kind of term which is very, I mean, relative. One cannot say that this is the only innovation. So like if you recall WIPO's theme of 2017, which I always quote, that was that innovation improving life. That was the quote. That was, their slogan. So in that way, whether we are evolving technologies which are benefiting the mankind, and when it is not benefiting and only benefiting the pharmaceutical sector, then how the state and industry interplay is going on. And you have also mentioned that sometimes in even US, when they saw that some sort of urgency was there, they were very much against some of the pharmaceutical companies. So they take some measure which may be, you can say, not that much practical, but that is very stern. So how you see that this innovation problem? First of all, there are no evidences, concrete evidences, which suggest that only patent would be an integer for encouraging innovation. As you already mentioned, that what is your value chain, how the delivery system work, how other things work. Many things decide the fate of innovation. It could not be that
Yeah.
patent. So I just want that you should
Yeah.
doing this thing.
Well, it's an important question. I don't think anybody really has a
Yeah.
perfect solution to this question. But the way that things work now is that, well, the cost of discovering, developing a drug, factoring in the failures is very high. Right? However, there is certainly a debate about how much the cost is. Has become very politicized, of course, right? But also there are serious sort of questions about transparency, and industry isn't necessarily as transparent, put it gently here, isn't necessarily as transparent as it might be about how much it really spends, right? And also how much spending of, taxpayer funding of biomedical research was important, essential. So they have a tendency to rather overstate their contribution, their financial contribution, and understate the contributions that come from governments, right? So, but on the argument that, it's I don't know, $2 billion, what they say, per medicine, we have to get that money back, so that we can then invest in further research and development. And to get that back means charging very high prices, right? Now, is that the best innovation model one could possibly think of, right? And you may be aware that some people like James Lava of Knowledge Ecology International have been proposing the idea of sort of delinkage, right? Which means that the cost must not reflect the high R&D costs. But of course, that means that somebody has to pay. I mean, someone's got to pay for this, right? Yeah. For a drug company to sell a medicine cheaply that it costs a lot of money to develop, well, the business case is, well, there isn't one, right? That's commercial suicide, right?
Yeah.
However, maybe there's a way, right? Maybe there is a way to make those medicines cheap and accessible. And remember, we must remember that important drugs are not just important for those patients, but they are good for the economy, right? The economy benefits from a healthy population. So there is a social benefit of these medicines beyond just the benefit for the individual person who gets the treatment, right? So either the sort of reimbursement for the drug company should either be on the basis of the health impact of that medicine. That's a proposal you may have heard of by Thomas Pogge, the German philosopher, and Aidan Hollis in Canada. That is the Health Impact Fund. Well, who pays? Be on the basis of what the charities or taxation of some kind or another, right? And interestingly enough, well, Thomas Pogge, I don't know if you know much about him, but he was a student of John Rawls, the philosopher who wrote a book called A Theory of Justice, right? And he comes up with this thought experiment, which you may know this, but a thought experiment. Supposing we are brought into the world behind a veil of ignorance, right? We don't know if we're going to be a male or female. We don't know if we're rich or we're going to be poor. If we are going to be handicapped or healthy. We don't know if we're into a family where, you know, the parents are alcoholics or they're violent, or you may have a very loving parent. You know, you don't know what endowments you will inherit when you are born, right? So, and ourself, what kind of society would you want? You might say, just in case, healthcare system, just in case I turn out to be right. Okay. And of course, in a way that is, you could say that is consistent with the idea of health insurance, right? Where you may pay health insurance, but you never get sick, right? Maybe you drop at age 100 sick, right? That gave a peace of mind, but it also somebody else was able to benefit, right? Yeah. So another. So in the same way, so they're thinking about, you know, if a medicine has a genuine health impact, so not to Botox, but a drug, you know, in accordance with how much it benefits public health, your medicine, then you get some reward, right? But that medicine itself would be available and would be cheap.
So how
and then there's, sorry?
Yeah, how you see that these new developments in personalized medicine, which are claiming so much high, like they are promising many things, individualized medicine, or you can say personalized medicine, which we all are working upon. So how you see that that very progress is impacting this very industry, that is pharmaceutical industry, number one, and number two, whether the promises which are being made by these new waves of medical care or medicine in the name of precision medicine.
Yeah.
Right medicine, do they really, I mean, claim
Okay.
what, I mean, thinking about that or something like that, or they are realistic or not? I mean, what you?
Yeah. Okay. Well, let me first get to precision medicine, but before precision medicine, I just want to say that in the UK, we have big debates about our health system is bad, and so it has its good points, but it's not perfect, that's for sure. But we have, when it comes to medicines, we have a government agency, clinical X or NICE, NICE.
Yeah.
And what they do, but basically get health economists to figure out, what is a medicine worth, right? Value, they price the industry, right? Lower than the company. Well, the company actually, the company will either accept it, say, okay, we accept it because basically it's government bias. So it's quite convenient for industry in a way that you have one buyer, right? So they'll say, okay, we'll accept the lower price, or we won't. Quite often they do, but sometimes they don't. So we had this medicine called Orcam for cystic fibrosis, right? And the government, the NIC, we will recommend the government pay this price. We want that price.
Yeah.
They walk to people who need, right? But on a strict a health economist valuation, it's not worth it, given all countries have a limited budget to spend on medicines.
Yeah,
it always limits. I do think, I think Americans pay too much. We probably pay too little in relation to our level of wealth. Um, that's what they agreed.
Yeah.
So, and because the industry, the company was scared compulsory licensing, I think, perhaps they were about. Also, they thought, well, what's the point of having a drug no one's going to buy?
Yeah. So
Eventually, okay.
Yeah.
So on the precision medicine, now, well, the difficulty is that the market can be quite small. But is that necessarily a problem? Maybe it's not, because the thing about precision medicine is that it's, you know, it's either for a disease that's very common, or in the early stages. But then you also have an advantage for industry, and the advantage is this, and I'll give you an example of there is also a recent patent case, European Patent Office a few years ago, where there was a medicine, I forget what it's for now. It was for some cancer or so, right? Now the medicine basically, so the company comes up with this new drug, right? Unfortunately, it's only effective for a few people, right? So overall, it's not a particularly good drug because it helps some people. It makes no difference for some people. Others, it may actually make them feel worse, not better. Right?
Yeah.
So what they do is that they identify they identify a genetic marker, right, which enables them to single out those people who benefit from this drug, right? So from a mediocre drug which doesn't work for many people, but with a large patient population, to to the same product, but for a much smaller patient group. But for those people, it is an outstanding product because they all, more or less, all of them benefit from the drug. Now you have a valuable product, even though the patient group is small, rather than a not very valuable product where the patient group is big. Right. And there was the European Patent Office had to determine the validity of a patent which essentially claimed, right, it claimed the use of an old drug for a disease it was already used for to a subset of patients already actually the drug by those patients by a genetic test, a molecular test. For those people, it actually worked. So sometimes a drug for a precision drug can actually be very commercially valuable. Now, a few years back, when I got very interested in reading about Gleevec, you know, the drug for one kind of myeloid leukemia. Of course, it's a very powerful product. It works very well. And I remember at the time I told my medical school, my university, I mentioned that Nicholas Lydon, who's one of the scientists who's involved in the development of Gleevec, well, he's graduate, they should invite him. So, and they did. So he came and they gave him an honorary PhD and I asked him something, because now the thing about Gleevec is that because this form of leukemia is well, you know, your leukemia was one disease, and now it's been split into many leukemias, right? So this is just for one leukemia. So so Novartis, well, it was, I think, Ciba-Geigy, then of course became Novartis. They didn't get for this drug because not enough people. And Leiden and this guy called Brian Drucker in the United States, who worked for a university hospital, the two of them had to persuade Novartis. Look, you know, you say there's no market. We believe there is, and so Novartis said, okay, they were and Drucker, and they decided to put it on the market, and it became a very successful, commercially successful medicine. And I asked him, do you find Big Pharma is still a bit slow to realize this, that, you know, that they can still make money out of these sort of precision medicines? The market is small. And he said, basically, yes. And he now works in the United States, which are looking at so-called kinase inhibitors, right? And he thinks that's the way to go. I think kinases are a family of enzymes which are related to the whole process which a cell turns into a cancer. And I've read elsewhere that it is not very creative, it's not very imaginative. They're not looking at the full range of possibilities. They're leaving it to the small companies to do all the really interesting sort of innovation. And then they license, basically, a Big Pharma comes in and does the clinical trials. So industry, he says, I mean, Big Pharma is still, in many ways, quite nowhere near as creative as they're very conservative. That's what he's saying to me.
Yeah, yeah. So just, I mean, this is a little bit upon this current situation where you are seeing that many companies are going for patent pledges, some collaborations, and open innovation and all that. And there are certain models, as you have also mentioned, that within the open innovation, it doesn't mean that there is absence of intellectual property. So there are various, I mean, strategies that are being made by these companies. And how do you, what extent you believe that is a very good model or something? And if that is a good model, whether that should be sustained in non-emergent situation also, not only in emergent situation. So what do you think about that?
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, I mean, I think the world has gotten very collaborative.
Yeah. Yeah.
Plus, a lot of work has been done by universities, and quite a lot of funding is coming from governments.
Yeah.
Not just from industry, right? So, and if you are a supporter of, open research, which I am, I'm bound to think this is good. And actually, we may get faster to a vaccine. I think well, no one knows when or if, even, right? No one knows, but if we are going to get a vaccine, and I hope we do, I hope for the whole world, right? Not just for my own part of the world, but for the whole world. We need this so much, right? I think that is where it's going to happen, and it will be a fantastic thing, right? But I think industry will be hoping that pressure not to assert IP and not to seen as being a bad guy, right? I think they will say, look, when the pandemic is over, the World Health Organization says the pandemic is over, it'll be back to making money again. So, well, we all, I think we know that the World Health Organization, in a way, through no fault of its own, is in a very political situation, right? But their decision to say the pandemic is over is going to be something that the industry is obviously going to be waiting for, right? Because that's when they're going to go back to their usual sort of model, right? But of course, the big problem is not, well, the big problem, well, two big problems. One is getting a vaccine, is getting a medicine, but also is in mass producing. I mean, we need, I don't know, what's the world population? 7 billion people now? I'm not sure now about that. We need 7 million people need vaccines, right? Billion need vaccines for us all to be safe. You know, if anybody is not getting it, then we're all, then then we have incomplete coverage, and that's not what we want. We want everyone to have it. And of course, some people don't like vaccines, right? The anti-vaxxers. And then as for medicine, of course, what we're seeing now with medicines is that first they're trying, aren't they, old drugs? Yeah, which is understandable, because that's the simplest thing. If you can find an old drug that that works, then you don't need a new one, right? And it's cheaper and easier and quicker to get there. And I don't know. Obviously, the chloroquine thing for me is probably ridiculous, right? It doesn't seem to be the way to go. At best, its use is going to be limited. And of course, there's Gilead's remdesivir, which was a failed Ebola medicine. At best, it seemed, well, it's early days. At best, it seems it's only going to be useful for some people. In the certain as the viral infection spreads in the body, manifests itself, and the symptoms only at certain time of that cycle of infection is it going to be useful for, not the whole thing. And of course, industry is always, one of the purposes of clinical trials is to expand as far as you can your patient group. So it may be that there'll be no one drug. There may be a number of different ones that, but who, I mean, I'm speculating here. But there's not going to be one cure,
Yeah, here in India also there are certain alternative routes are being taken also, like in alternative medicines, because problem with regulatory, process and all that, because of we are not that much enriched with clinical trials and all that. So because of that, there's some sort of obstruction, but they are putting their efforts to come up with something which could assist at least or supplement this kind of situation. So, lastly, I will ask you that how you see the fate, or you can say future, of pharmaceutical industries, and whether the current structure will last long or there would be a certain change into that. And number two is whether companies are also realizing that they should bring some good name to them, or improve their image or something, or they are just engrossed in business only, or what is your take on that? How you see this?
Well, okay. On the future of the industry, and then we talk about the image. Yeah, the future of the industry is one that's obviously it is hard to predict, but I think it's changed quite a lot. I think every company has its day, right? And these companies have had a good run. They have had a good run for that 140 years. They've done, bio, etc. They've had a very good run. So they'll be around, but will they be dominant? And of course, what is going to happen, and there are signs already, is that the geography of innovation in biomedicine, which is largely clustered in Europe, North America, a bit Japan, a bit Korea, a little bit China, more and more, and then you got your large developing countries, well, India, Brazil, and others. That's going to change. And actually, I think that will be a good thing rather than, rather than a bad thing. I mean, it'd be a good thing because actually we want more people actually innovating in health. And I don't really care the country on their passport is not very important to me, right? I think it's, innovation. The more innovation goes on, the broader the geography innovation. It's a 100% good thing. And we have sort of seen biotech companies becoming very big. Amgen, Gilead is only what, I think 30 years old or so. So they are being challenged. Yeah, so that's going to change. But in terms of the sort of business model, I suppose if it's just about chemistry and biology, the business model is not going to change radically, subject to the partial adoption of these other innovation models I've mentioned, de-linkage and high health impact fund. This can come into play in different ways, and changing the regulatory structure will affect the business models of businesses. But one thing, and I find it hard to speculate, but I'm pretty sure that data and information, controlling data and information, is going to be a big thing. And obviously precision, accuracy of medicines is not just about what we know about the chemistry, the mode of action when a active ingredient enters a cell. That's obviously always going to be important, but that's never going to be the whole thing. So data, information, and Bayer and Pfizer and GlaxoSmithKline are not the companies that do this, right? Of course, you have companies like Apple and Facebook, right? Think of the data that they have, Apple. So it's not just about, of course, it's not about just about sort of DNA, about molecular data, genetics and stuff. It's also about lifestyle, etc., etc. There's so many, so I mean, I often think data can be a bit overhyped, but there's no doubt that it is incredibly important. So controlling data is health related data, and gleaning health relevant information out of data. Being good at that is going to give you an entry into the healthcare business, which might enable you to become very dominant.
Yeah.
In which case, these sorts of firms, which are basically chemical companies, basically they are fine chemical firms. They become a service of data firms rather than the other way around. That might be the trend that we're moving towards, but it's hard to say. I've never been accurate at predicting.
So conclusively, I mean,
and about the image. Oh, so you also asked me about image, how to change the about the image of industry, right? Why do they have? Can they do something about their image? Well, I suppose they, it's very hard to separate. It's very hard to treat the United States as just any other country, right? I actually find the whole thing about influencing politicians, the amount of money that's spent in Washington on sort of changing the minds of politicians with a bit of money. I actually find it well, I mean, industry does this, not just pharmaceutical industry, but I do find it is very perverse. It is really appalling. I find marketing of medicines, the way it's done, is it's really appalling. So there are things that should be fixed, but for some reason they just can't. I don't know why they can't be fixed. I mean, you know, we've managed to control the tobacco industry.
Yeah.
I don't see why we can't control other industries. If I'm not comparing medicines to cigarettes, right?
Yeah.
I know when Sir Walter Raleigh brought tobacco from the Americas in the 16th century, he said, this is really good for your health. But we know it's not true, right? But medicines, okay, presumably they are, well, medicines are poisons, but they are therapeutic poisons, right? So they are good for you, right, when you need them. But at the same time, you know, we can control an industry when we want it to and still allow it to make money.
Yeah.
Right. You know, tobacco companies in the UK, Australia, the countries, they can't show their brands, but people still smoke, people still buy cigarettes, right? So they're still making profits, still making money, right? So, you know, I mean, industry does good things as well, right? I mean, you know, they've the free gift of ivermectin in West Africa, well, it has saved many people from getting blindness. You know, this, I think it's from a parasite in rivers, and that was a donation by, I think, by Merck of medicine, and it has saved the eyesight of many people in Africa. And of course, well, if they had sold it, they wouldn't have made much money because people are very poor in that part of the world, right? The poorest part of the world. But at the same time, it was still, you know, they made an effort to actually deliver it to people. So that's, I mean, I have to say, well done. That's fantastic, right? You know, I think certain forms of business behavior are so deeply rooted. It takes a while to change. You know? And even people who are very pro-industry will still admit that sometimes the industry is a bit slow to find new ways to innovation. These are big companies and they are slow to change, but they can, right? Just because you've been doing this for 140 years doesn't mean you have to keep on doing it, right? So, you know, that sort of culture change, I think, can happen. But it won't happen by themselves, right? And that takes me back to what I said at the beginning, which is that it's a whole, you know, it's a regulatory system, and that regulatory complex can be shifted, changed, altered, modified, right? To encourage, not really force, but to encourage the industry, incentivize industry. Look, there are other ways you can still make quite a lot of money, right? But we want you to do it this way, right? And in a democratic system, right, in a democratic or capitalist system, we regulate the market. Markets are all regulated, right? You know, people talk about free trade. You know, the World Trade Organization. It's about free trade. No, it's about trade regulation, right? Trade regulation to prevent trade barriers that are unnecessary, right? That have perverse effects on people's prosperity. That's the view, okay? I mean, one can argue about that, but it's a general view that trade, and I think it's true, trade is regulated in order to achieve the goals that you want to achieve from people trading with each other across national boundaries, right? You have to regulate to make it work. No argument about that. So you have to regulate an industry to make it work. Why not? We do regulate it, but we regulate it better. So let's not just accuse industry of doing what industry has to do to enhance shareholder value. We have to take it as our responsibility, as citizens. It's up to us as well. It's not just them, the bad guys. Let's go and punish them for this. Well, let's all work together to make a better industry.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, conclusively, I mean, because we started with the historical inquiry, so I hope
Yeah.
these inquiries are very much relevant. I mean, to understand, all understand the various threats of this industry. So you cannot, I mean, talk in here. I mean,
Yes.
having a proper inquiry in the history, and as you see, like in India, it is being said that various pandemics happened in the past, and
Yeah.
it was
Yeah. Yeah.
to, I mean, eradicate that or through a kind of, I mean, attempt. So we need to understand that how pandemics have been treated, and I mean, in history, how they are being approached. And think that the historical inquiries should be more and more, as you are totally
Yeah.
devoted to that.
Yes.
Do you think?
Well, that's
Yeah, yeah,
sorry, after you. Now,
yeah,
just going to say that's not. I mean, the pharmaceutical industry job is to treat illnesses that we have, not illnesses that we might have in the future, right? Uh, so that's the yeah. So to prepare for pandemics is not the duty; it is the duty of government. I
yeah,
would say
yeah, yeah,
that is what governments have to do, and a lot of governments have done a poor job. I would say,
yeah, yeah.
right? They could have done better.
Actually, what
Yeah.
is happening right now, I must say a few things. Like when you talk about duty, there may be
Yeah.
twofold of duties, and one of the duties, when you are pushing duty much and much more and more, then
Yeah.
you are just refraining from your responsibility as a nation. So there the problem.
Yeah.
is. So if you are understanding the rights properly of the citizens and take your duty as a, I mean, as a main duty in this very
Yeah.
fundament, then the thing becomes a little
Yeah.
important, and that is more effective. I mean, in that sense, that you can curb this very menace in a proper way, rather than if you
Sure. Yeah.
are taking this very burden, or you are asking people that you must behave in such a manner and in such a way, then as you said, that the bigger responsibility always lies on the states. So it is
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that that's true. Um, yeah. Two things to say here. One is that there was a popular view recently about globalization where where well it's companies that rule the world, not governments. And
yeah.
I think certainly I think for a lot of people, certainly in my own country now, we're realizing that isn't true.
Yeah,
Governments still are all powerful. When they assert themselves, governments are very powerful. Yeah. But also I wanted to say, you mentioned about rights, of course. One thing I didn't say anything about before, which I perhaps should have done, but I'll say it now, is of course there is such a thing as a human right to health.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yes,
And everything else must be balanced with that, you know. Well, not balanced because actually the human right is an absolute right, but how to put it into effect must be balanced with other considerations in a complex modern economy. Right?
yeah,
It's not an easy thing to say. Well, it's easy to say it, if not put it into effect. Is obviously not a simple matter. Right?
yeah. So
At
let's see
all.
how the things will go. And as an academic, we can do these things to highlight these concerns and try to
Yeah,
put
yeah,
everything before the people, before the government also, so that there
yeah.
must be some change. As you know, there must be some change in the frameworks, in the practices. And there are countries, and I must tell you that the
Hmm.
threats are not connected yet. And if you go
Yeah,
by any policy, you will find that it is not because of the policy, I mean,
yeah,
content is at failure. It is because of that distribution system, the way
yeah.
we are dealing with society, the way we are treating the people. So all these
Hmm.
things, I mean, concur to constitute that kind of problem. So you have to identify the threats, and you need to change the framework also. As I said, that
Yeah, yeah,
a kind of responsible role must be taken by every being. And
yeah,
we try to push and highlight to our, we have our own limits, and we have our own other
yeah,
areas to discuss. But what
yeah,
fascinates me is that the way you catch up various discussions in your book, in the previous first
yeah.
one, uh, I
Hmm.
I must remember one thing. I mean, I must tell you that the talk between the lawyer Pat Mooney with Anand
Yeah,
Mohan Chakrabarty, and you have, I mean, you have beautifully portrayed that very interaction in your book. That is
yeah.
I mean, in very stable form in my mind. And you, at that very moment, Anand Mohan Chakrabarti was very hesitant that he would get a patent or not. But his daughter
Yes, that's it.
was achieving the
Yeah,
full climate in a very, very miraculous way. It was all
yeah,
that he must proceed with that. So the things like that, if they are portrayed in a form which is interesting to the readers and I mean to the audience,
yeah.
then many
Mhm.
things could trigger, I mean, to happen. So in that way, I hope that your book, and I must catch it up as soon as I can, uh,
Yeah,
at High Design of Purest Gold, a critical history of the pharmaceutical industry. So we need to understand the behavior of this very industry, first of all, and whether that has
yeah,
changed or not. And what you did, you have encompassed the 140 years history. Some sort of
yes,
your first-hand experience and some sort of, I hope that whatever you inquired very seriously about that. So, and because
yeah,
you're
yeah.
involved in various practices you have been a part of as a teacher, as you mentioned, in Africa and
Hmm.
countries you spend some time. So it adds so much value to this very book and the insights which are coming from it. And from one chapter which you sent to me for this very discussion, that was very enlightening and very engaging. So I always
Yeah.
to trigger something, so we can catch it up and proceed. And in
Yeah.
that way,
Well, there's certain books that you have to be quite old to write, you know. It's not a book I could have written 20 years ago, you know.
of course, one book you have
Yeah.
referred in a tweet, which I just remember. I don't remember the exact title. That was industrial development without IPR or something, patents.
That's innovation without oh
Innovation.
yeah, industrialization without patents
Yeah, yeah,
by Schiff,
yeah.
Eric Schiff, where he shows that Switzerland, well, Switzerland didn't have a patent law, and they excluded chemicals for a long time.
Mhm.
Uh, and the Netherlands abolished its patent law in 1869 until the early part of the 20th century. And he shows those countries grew very fast economically during those times, but there are no patents.
So
But,
people are questioning that. I mean, whether patents will continue or there is a need for change or something. So there are some group of people who are saying that it must be totally thrown out or something, taking very extreme, I mean, position. What I think that I'm not that much, I mean, I can't say that I can take a final call regarding that.
yeah,
But their changes are required much in the practices of patents rather than the framework of patent, which I think of.
yeah,
Because,
yeah,
as a framework, it still looks very balanced. I mean, if
yeah,
you take a holistic view that with all the limitations which are being embedded in that very system, you'll find that it is pretty balanced. But when it comes to practice and how the patent offices are reacting, how the companies are reacting, it is depending more on that those abuses, or you can say, I mean, uses. So
yeah. Well, that's right. Yes, and yeah, transferring a patent system that has evolved in a part of in a certain part of the world to other places
yeah,
uh, is very, very hard. I mean, I did some work in some African countries. I went to Zambia and Ghana, and I've been to Francophone West Africa. And you know, these countries, some of these countries have almost no patent attorneys, right? So
okay.
if you are a local company and you come up with something really clever, um, the, well, it's very likely that they're not really aware of the patent system. They may not, well, you know, I mean, yeah, well, who do we ask, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
We get somebody to write a patent application. Where do we apply to? You know, when I was in Ghana and I was a consultant for the Ghana Health Service, right? And I talked to, well, I mean, in the IP office, not really, it's the registrar's office, and there are a tiny number of people who work there. And if they want to know the patent situation regarding a particular medicine, so in other words, you know, can they import a medicine or can they, you know, permit the importation of a medicine into Ghana? In order to find out, they have to email the the headquarters of the African Regional IP Office, which is in Harare, Zimbabwe, which is like half a continent away, and ask them, is there a patent on this medicine? To tell them, because they have no records in their office, right? And of course, you know, as you'll be aware yourself, to know the scope of a patent, you have to read the patent.
Yeah, yeah.
So you don't know exactly what you can do. Where is your freedom to operate without reading the actual patent, or maybe other patents that are relevant to that invention? So, you know, this is not very satisfactory. The lack of information and the lack of capacity. So, I mean, can you use a patent system in these countries? Well, you know, I mean, if you're a big drug company, you will know how to file a patent application with the African Office. We gives you, when that is granted, this is a bundle of national patents in a lot of African countries. You have that. Yeah. If you're a local, I mean, you don't necessarily know how to do this. There's, you know, it might be there's one patent attorney in the capital city.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
He's very busy working for Pfizer and GlaxoSmithKline. That hasn't got the time for, well, if there's only one, right? So there are these massive problems, right?
You're pretty right. I mean, there is a problem of drafting also, which is not that much, I mean, good in many countries.
No.
Clever companies have a great team of that, devoted team of that, where they can pass easily whatever hurdle the patent system creates of a particular country.
Yeah,
so another kind of, countries are not that much empowered and skilled to utilize the patents. So, is also a thing, but as you know, it is a well-tested system which runs for a long time. So I don't think that in near future that would be totally replaced. But yes, there may be certain changes which may come, and we have to be watchful that what is going wrong with this very system. So thank you so much. You have, I mean, devoted 1.5 hours for me.
Oh wow, that went very fast. Yeah.
but it was so fascinating that I couldn't realize that how much time that was. I mean, I must thank you, and I must keep you engaged in future and to have the insight, because the story which you tell, I must say that you are a good storyteller also through your work.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Stories always fascinate new, I mean, researchers, many people who try to do something new. So in that way, keep us influencing, keep us inspiring, and we hope that you are well there in UK, and
yeah, you too.
You are doing well. Yeah. So
sure. Okay.
Let's see in near future this will be the present crisis will just be, I mean, taken care of, and we will be.
Let's hope so. Yeah.
So thank you very much, and we.
Okay. All right.